Internal Israeli government documents have revealed the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence is recommending the forcible transfer of the entire population of Gaza and setting up a, quote, sterile zone of several kilometers near the border between Egypt and Gaza.
This is a massive operation of killing, of ethnic cleansing, of depopulation.
This idea to transfer Gaza's 2.3 million population.
Hey everyone, it's David, producer for The Benjamin Dixon Show, and like it or not. So amidst Israel's continued siege on Gaza, which is now including a ground offensive, yet another bombing of a refugee camp in Gaza, there is now reporting that Israel is actively lobbying Egypt to relocate the population of Palestinians in Gaza to Sinai.
This is a proposal that has been drafted by Israel's intelligence ministry. What it has said is the most desirable outcome for Israelis and Israeli security is this idea to transfer Gaza's 2.3 million population into the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt.
We know that since really the beginning of this conflict, especially since the siege started, I think 2 days after October 7th, that Israel was asking Egypt to take refugees.
Egypt is the only country other than Israel to share a border crossing with Gaza. And what we've seen since October 7th is a lot of negotiations around what's going to happen at this border crossing. Egyptian sources have told us that in those days, in the beginning at least, there was a lot of pressure and continuing for Egypt to open the Rafah border crossing, to create a so-called humanitarian corridor, and to allow for the forcible displacement of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from Gaza into northern Sinai.
And Egypt, as well as other neighboring countries like Jordan, have been extremely reluctant to take any refugees for a multitude of reasons, but not least of which because Israel has a history of not accepting refugees back. They don't allow Palestinians that are taken in from other countries. Historically, they don't allow them to come back home.
Palestine is a touchstone issue for so many across the Arab world, for so many across the global south. And this idea of what they call a second Nakba, a second catastrophe and a second mass displacement, is firmly rejected.
Understandably, across the Arab world, this has caused a lot of distress. From Egypt's perspective, they don't want the Gazan problem to become their issue. Egypt says it doesn't want 2.3 million refugees from Gaza to become Egypt's issue. It's also dredged up a lot of trauma for Palestinians, not just here, but also further around the world, reminiscent of what they say is incidents surrounding the 1948 creation of Israel, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were fled or were forced from their homes during the fighting surrounding the creation.
Well, now we have reporting that Israel is lobbying Egypt by way of what can really only be seen as a bribe. According to Egypt Independent, their article dated October 31st, 2023, is headlined, "Israel Considers Settling Palestinians in Sinai in Exchange for Writing Off Egypt's Debt." And it cites a newspaper. That newspaper is an Israeli paper. According to this piece, quote, Israeli newspaper revealed a new plan being considered by Tel Aviv to persuade Egypt to receive all residents of Gaza and settle them in its territory within Sinai, in exchange for writing off all of Egypt's debts to the World Bank.
We've been offering economic incentives to Egypt to do so. We have to remember Egypt is undergoing a very severe economic crisis with a massive amount of debt, with record high inflation. And so, there's been talk of debt relief, of financial compensation in order to allow for this kind of displacement.
According to the newspaper, Israel is trying its best to pressure Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to accept refugees from the Gaza Strip. It reported that Egypt fears that large numbers of refugees will attempt to cross and penetrate the Rafah border crossing. And I'll just stop the quote there for a moment and say, yeah, of course people are going to try to seek safety when they're being bombed constantly. There are those that will insist on staying because this is their home. But then there are those that are going to run for their lives. They're going to seek refuge, literally, and seek safety wherever they can. I'll continue reading. Sisi said earlier that the Egyptian people will strongly oppose the arrival of Palestinian refugees from Gaza Strip to Sinai. Such a move would turn Sinai into a center from which attacks against Israel would be launched, and Egypt would turn into a base for armed operations which could drag Egypt into war with Israel, he warned. It's not only because Egypt fears that Israel won't allow the Palestinians to return, but also because they fear that it will become a point of attack. They don't want Sinai to essentially be a launch point for attacks against Israel, because Israel would retaliate and hit that area as well. This all points to the fears of a broader escalated conflict that spills outside of Israel and Palestinian territories. That's also why people are carefully watching Iran, because Iran is known as a funder and backer of Hamas, and depending on how Iran responds to Israel's retaliation against Hamas for October 7th, all eyes are really on Iran and how they are reacting and potentially responding, because we know Iran backs Hamas, and if Tehran makes moves, that really would be what could potentially trigger a much broader conflict in the region. This isn't the only reporting on the subject, though. The Times of Israel also has reporting. The Times of Israel has a piece, also dated for October 31st, 2023. It's headlined, Intelligence Ministry Concept Paper Proposes Transferring Gazans to Egypt's Sinai. The subtitle says, Prime Minister's Office plays down document as hypothetical, non-binding, though Netanyahu is reported to be lobbying the EU governments to pressure Egypt to take in refugees. So the tone of this piece actually has it as a rumor, rather than how the Egypt Independent frames it as actually happening based on the reporting from the Israeli newspaper. But the Times of Israel is saying it's more of a rumor and acknowledges that the Israeli government is trying to deny it. Apparently it's not just direct lobbying between Israel and Egypt, but Netanyahu's actually apparently trying to pressure Europe to pressure Egypt.
Instead of the United States and other Western countries pressuring Israel for a ceasefire, pressuring Israel to create, to allow in the necessary amount of aid, they have instead been pressuring Egypt to open the border and allow for this mass displacement.
So according to the Times of Israel, quote, Israel acknowledged Monday that one of its ministries drafted a wartime proposal to transfer the Gaza Strip's 2.3 million people to Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, drawing condemnation from the Palestinians and worsening tensions with Cairo. And pausing there, both articles, both from the Egypt Independent and the Times of Israel, mention that it's not just relocating some Palestinians. They're actually looking to take the entirety of the population of Gaza and move them out of Israel and Palestinian territory. Netanyahu has said, going as far back as 2015, he would not allow a Palestinian state while he is in power.
At Judaism's holiest site, Benjamin Netanyahu gave a prayer of thanks for his political comeback.
I appreciate the decision by Israel's citizens to elect me and my friends against all odds and in the face of powerful forces.
His surprising and crushing victory, the product of an 11th-hour push for right-wing votes, promising there would be no Palestinian state on his watch, and whipping up fear on Facebook with a warning to the base, get out and vote to prevent Arab parties from unseating him.
The right regime is in danger. The Arab voters are coming in huge amounts to the polls.
And in order to govern, he's teamed up with the far right in Israel. Specifically, Itamar Ben-Gvir.
He's best known for calling for the killing of Palestinians and the rallying cry, death to Arabs. He's led far-right Zionist mobs in Sheikh Jarrah and repeatedly stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque. Itamar Ben-Gvir has won big at the Israeli elections and is becoming a major influence in the country's politics. Ben-Gvir is a self-described disciple of extremist rabbi and former Knesset member Meir Kahane, who founded the Kach party. And even though the Koch Party was eventually designated as a terrorist organization and outlawed in 1994, its racist ideology still looms over Israeli politics today. In 2007, Ben-Gvir was convicted of incitement to terrorism and support for a designated terrorist organization.
And Gallant, two ministers in his cabinet who are on record and have actively campaigned on the idea of eliminating the Palestinian people. So the article continues. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office played down the report compiled by the intelligence ministry as a hypothetical exercise, a, quote, concept paper. But its conclusions deepened long-standing Egyptian fears that Israel wants to make Gaza into Egypt's problem and revived for Palestinians memories of their greatest trauma, the uprooting of hundreds of thousands of people who fled or were forced from their homes during the fighting surrounding Israel's creation in 1948. That paragraph was specifically referencing the Nakba, where approximately 750,000 Palestinians were forced out and removed. The article continues and quotes a spokesman for the Palestinian Authority. Quote, "We are against transfer to any place, in any form, and we consider it a red line that we will not allow to be crossed." Nabil Abu Rudaini, spokesman for Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, said of the report. The spokesman continued, quote, "What happened in 1948 will not be allowed to happen again," unquote. A mass displacement, Rudaini, the spokesperson, said, would be, quote, "tantamount to declaring a new war," unquote. The Times of Israel also continues in the piece by looking at the actual proposal, the document that this is all based on. And it says, quote, "The document is dated October 13th, 6 days after the Hamas attack. It was first published by Sicha Mekomet, a local news site. In its report, the Intelligence Ministry, a junior ministry that conducts research but does not set policy, so it's not binding. I'll continue reading, though. The document offered three alternatives. Quote, "To effect a significant change in the civilian reality in the Gaza Strip in light of the Hamas crimes that led to the Sword of Iron War," using the IDF label given to the war. The document proposes moving Gaza's civilian population to 10 cities in northern Sinai, then building permanent cities and an undefined humanitarian corridor. A security zone would be established inside Israel to block the displaced Palestinians from entering. The report did not say what would become of Gaza once its population is cleared out, but its authors deemed this alternative to be the most desirable for Israel's security. I think it's really important to focus on a sentence before that, though. A security zone would be established inside Israel to block the displaced Palestinians from entering. So while it doesn't say what would be done with Gaza, it's definitely avoiding Palestinians from returning. This in and of itself is the problem. It confirms the fears about refugees being removed and not allowed back in. The piece goes on to focus on Egypt's perspective and position on things, saying Egypt's foreign ministry did not immediately respond to a request for comment on the report, but Egypt has made clear throughout this latest war that it does not want to take in a wave of Palestinian refugees. Egypt has long feared that Israel wants to force a permanent expulsion of Palestinians into its territory, as happened during the war surrounding Israel's independence. Egypt ruled Gaza between 1948 and 1967, when Israel captured the territory along with the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The vast majority of Gaza's population are the descendants of Palestinian refugees that uprooted from what is now Israel. So to be clear, for those that aren't aware, the majority of the population in Gaza lived in territory that is now claimed by Israel. They were forced out into Egypt and only made it back in within Israel's borders because Israel captured the territory of Gaza during the 1967 Middle East War. Now, the piece goes on and says that Egypt's president has said that basically taking in refugees would eliminate the cause of Palestinian nationalism, creating a Palestinian state. It also focuses on a peace treaty signed between Israel and Egypt in 1979 and says that it would jeopardize that because it would create friction between the two countries. The Times of Israel also looked at doubts about legitimacy. Towards the end of the article, they say, quote, Egypt would not necessarily be the Palestinian refugees' last stop. The document speaks about Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates supporting the plan either financially or by taking in uprooted residents of Gaza as refugees and in the long term as citizens. Canada's, quote, lenient, unquote, immigration practices also make it a potential resettlement target, the document adds. So Israel is basically trying to just not only push Palestinian civilians out without any regard for Palestinian tradition, literally disregarding the value and the importance and the significance of the land that Israel stands on and that importance to the Palestinian people, forcing them to find a new home, losing their culture, losing their, in the long run, probably losing their language and losing a lot of their ideals. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Because to me, excuse my privilege, but it sounds a lot like what colonists have done time and time again, whether it be Canadians doing to their indigenous people, the United States doing to their indigenous people, and to slaves that came from Africa, wiping away culture for the sake of land and domination. So the last part I want to take a look at in the piece is the very last section where it talks about how Egypt is being lobbied. And the Times of Israel reads, despite the downplaying of the paper by Netanyahu's office, the Financial Times reported Monday that the premier has sought to convince European leaders to pressure Egypt into accepting refugees. Officials from the Czech Republic and Austria relayed the idea during a meeting of European leaders last week, but officials from France, Germany, and the UK quickly rejected the proposal as unrealistic, given Egypt's public opposition to taking in refugees. Israel has refused to publicly promise the refugees will be allowed back into Gaza if they leave, hardening Cairo's stance against the idea, an Arab diplomat told the Times of Israel last week. This piece gives us a picture of the resistance Israel is facing. Despite public support broadly for Israel in the West, between Europe and the United States, Canada, despite unwavering support publicly, we know that the Biden administration behind the scenes was really pressing for Israel to not do a ground offensive. That looks to have only been delayed but not stopped completely, because now we see a ground offensive forming. And Israel is showing its face because they won't commit to allowing them to come back. So you're denying that you're trying to do this, but at the same time, you won't promise to allow them to come back. I mean, we read between the lines here. So I don't think that this will be the last we see of this, especially because while the Israeli government is trying to downplay it, they're obviously pushing this in the back channels. And depending on how long this war drags out for, and if it does spill over outside of Israel's borders, it's not difficult to see how this could start to pick up steam and world players really start to consider it. I think it's extremely clear just how fragile things are right now internationally. So I thought that this was important to note. I haven't seen a whole lot of discussion from media outlets on it, and I think that it's important to keep on our minds and not let it just be swept under the rug for it to all of a sudden pop up when it's being taken seriously. This is a serious matter, and we all have to be cognizant and aware of it. Anyway, let us know what you think in the comments. Don't forget, as always, to like, subscribe, and hit the notification button. And we'll be back with more.